with Bristow McEwen, and I'd like to take this opportunity to try and present some of the research I've done in the past to spark some discussion and maybe initiate some collaborations. So a lot of this work is from my dissertation that I did at UCF with Dr. Kenneth Stanley. So one thing that really interests me is evolution's creativity in particular. I think all of us can agree that natural evolution is a very powerful creative process. That's probably one thing that unites all of us. And one way I like to think of it is that if you had a bicycle and you put it in a closet, you closed the door, and waited 1 billion years and opened the door, you really would not be surprised. You're going to have low expectation for what's coming out of that closet. It's going to be a pile of dust. And in contrast, if you put evolution into a closet for a long period of time, you get an explosion of diverse complexity. And that ability for evolution to surprise us is, I think, a really interesting thing. So one question that drives my research is, can we exploit nature's creativity computationally? And this is a natural fit with the ideas of evolutionary computation, where researchers create evolutionary algorithms that are inspired by nature. And one really interesting question that this brings up when you're trying to create an algorithm is, what is a good abstraction of evolution? Because evolution is this really huge process in the natural world, and it's very rich, and there's lots of details that you could choose to focus on. So when you create an abstraction, you're forced with the dilemma of what particular details to make central in your algorithm and what to wipe away. And historically, evolutionary computation in large scale has treated evolution mainly as an optimizer. That it's a force that can optimize some quantity, make it higher, make it better. And this is driven by the idea that in nature there's this competition among organisms, some optimization of biological fitness, the idea of survival of the fittest. And what researchers can do is take this idea of biological fitness and abstract it into a fitness function. And the benefit of doing this is that you can then apply evolution to whatever problem you would like. You can specify some kind of target that you'd like to evolve towards, and your fitness function can kind of measure progress along the way. And what you're doing, in effect, is giving your algorithm an inherent objective, which is to discover a solution that maximizes this fitness function. And usually what this entails is that you have some kind of behavior you'd like to evolve, some kind of problem whose area you want to minimize, and your fitness function is designed to reward progress along that front. And so one issue with this is that when we try to scale optimization up to really, really complex problems, you run into the problem that it's hard. It's hard to do this. It's hard to set an arbitrary target and evolve towards it. And of course, there have been many successes of evolution as an optimizer, but just when we try to scale it up to really, really hard things, we run into this problem of deception. And the problem with deception is that basically, at some point, when your initial starting point and your target point are far enough removed, the stepping stones along the way may no longer resemble that final thing you're looking for. So, for example, in this picture, we have on the left a flatworm and the right a person. And looking forward from a flatworm, it'd be hard to imagine that this is clearly a stepping stone on the way to human-level intelligence, and yet it was. So the flatworm is one of our evolutionary precursors. And in general, it's a fallacy to assume that the conditions of the phenomenon will resemble the phenomenon itself. Now, this idea holds if your starting point and your goal point are close enough together. But when you try to kind of do things where you want to reach something like human-level intelligence from random origins, this idea breaks down. And we can think of this in terms of also human innovation, that this can also inform our intuitions about why this might be the case. So oftentimes, human innovation, when we're discovering new inventions, it doesn't work as some kind of linear path towards something. Optimizing a candle is not going to get you to a light bulb, because the innovations that enable this better light production system are not really directly related to light itself. It's related to discovering physical laws, structure that is not useful directly in creating a light bulb, but that at some point, after you accumulate enough knowledge about how electricity works, how filaments work, you can then create a light bulb. And similarly, optimizing an abacus won't get you to a computer. And a similar idea, works in natural evolution as well, and that natural evolution isn't driving towards some uber objective. That evolution accumulates structure generally that's advantageous for one purpose that later may be exapted for another purpose. So the feathers of birds, for example, have first evolved to do something less ambitious than fly, which was to regulate temperature. And later they were exapted to aid in gliding, and then from gliding they went to flight. And similarly, the lung of a primitive fish evolved first for breathing, and then later evolved into a gas bladder for buoyancy. So it's kind of a common story in innovation in lots of systems, that the stepping stones need not resemble the final objective, and then oftentimes it's easier just to accumulate structure, and that will kind of broaden the things that you can reach from there. And so the reason why I'm talking about deception and why optimization may not scale to huge levels of complexity is that I want to motivate the idea of looking at alternative abstractions of evolution. That there's not just one way to view natural evolution. We can abstract in many ways by focusing on different details of what drives evolution. And in particular, other views other than optimization may better capture evolution's creativity. So while an ambitious goal of perhaps optimization is to specify any target and then reach it, a different goal, but equally perhaps ambitious, is to create an algorithm that will create an explosion of diverse complexity in whatever domain you put it in. So it might not necessarily solve every problem, but you can imagine that you put it in some place and it will keep inventing new, novel things that are very complex and different. So what I want to do is talk about some experiments that explore this idea of alternative abstractions. And most of these experiments will take place talking about neuroevolution. So neuroevolution is an area that's ripe with deception, because the basic idea of it is to evolve really complex behaviors, really complex brains. And neuroevolution, in general, attempts to mirror how intelligence arose in nature. So biological brains evolved through natural evolution, and so computationally you might be able to apply an abstraction of evolution, an evolutionary algorithm, to an abstraction of the brain, an artificial neural network. And this way we might be able to evolve intelligent behavior. So the idea of an artificial neural network is biologically inspired by biological brains. And in particular, the networks I'll be talking about today are very simple. So they wipe away nearly all biological details, but they just kind of act as simple computational units that signals can propagate through in a similar abstract way as to how they propagate in biological brains. So neurons and synapses are abstracted as nodes and connections in one of these networks. And what's really interesting about them is that they can actually be used to control robots and encode their behavior. And this idea is called evolutionary robotics. And so we can use neuroevolution then to evolve robotic behaviors. And the way that this works is that you can imagine a robot might have certain sensors that allow it to perceive the world, like a camera or rangefinder sensors. And these can input signals into the neural network. The neural network can do some kind of computational processing of these input signals. And then the output nodes of the neural network can be connected to motors of this robot. So you have this closed loop system where a robot is being controlled by something that you've evolved. And so you can imagine that deception might be ripe in a field that is aiming to evolve perhaps human-level intelligence in a computer. But in fact, it's you can actually see it in very simple domains as well. So not just that kind of ambitious idea, but just in this simple maze idea that I'm going to present here. So imagine you're looking top-down at a maze, and this blue circle represents some kind of robot, and the X is kind of a point that you'd like this robot to reach. So the problem for this robot is that there's this wall in the way that complicates how it gets to this goal. So if you just reward the robot naively for getting closer to the goal, by a measure of Euclidean distance, then it's going to kind of optimize this behavior by getting closer and closer. And yet, we can see that this is a case of deception, and that although it's kind of reached a locally optimal point for this distance to the goal, the true path to the goal is different. It involves going around this obstacle. This is just a simple example of deception. And so before I go on to present novelty search, which is a way to abstract evolution as a search for novelty, I want to first talk about other ways of mitigating deception. So deception is a huge problem in evolutionary computation in general, because it keeps us from reaching the kind of things that we'd like to evolve. And as a result, there have been many methods that mitigate deception. And oftentimes, these will increase the reach of what kinds of targets you can reach. But the problem with all of them is that ultimately the objective is still its guiding search. You're still using a fitness function. You're still trying to direct search towards something. And if the deception is perverse enough, which it seems like it gets to that point, the more ambitious your objective is, then these methods ultimately will not scale as well as perhaps something not guided by an objective. So this leads us to the question, are objectives necessary? Because while the objective may mislead search by leading us directly into local optima, it intuitively seems necessary. It's hard to imagine a search process without direction that still is useful to us or interesting to us, with one notable exception. So natural evolution itself, the exemplar for evolutionary computation, it really has no final objective beyond increasing the survival and reproduction ability of organisms. It's not progressing towards some ultimate organism. It's kind of spreading outwards through niches and finding ways to, new ways to survive and reproduce. So we can take this as an inspiration that perhaps we could create an evolutionary algorithm that has no objective and yet could still do interesting things in whatever domain we put it in. And so hopefully at this point I've motivated the idea that we can abstract evolution in different ways, and one possible way to do this is as a search for novelty. So clearly natural evolution is not directly a search for novelty, but it is a diversion process that expands through niches and over large timescales does exhibit a drive towards novelty. So as a very coarse abstraction, not trying to be biologically plausible, but just we can view evolution, if we want, as an accumulator of novelty and kind of wipe away everything else. And so what this allows us to do is just to examine that force in isolation. And maybe this is an important force in nature, and maybe it can also be used in an artificial sense for our benefit. And one way to think about this is in terms of stepping stones. So I've kind of talked about these a little bit already, but they're the necessary precursors that you need to discover to get to where you want to go. And the fitness heuristic that we use in fitness functions and evolutionary algorithms generally rewards for increasing similarity to the thing you want to see. So that's one way to consider the potential stepping stones. But as we've seen, the stepping stones to this objective, they don't always resemble it. And so we might want to have a wider conception of stepping stones so that we can discover more things. And one particular way to do this is through considering novelty. And so what I'll be talking about here is behavioral novelty. I'll be talking about it in the context of these robot behaviors. And the benefit of using a search for novelty is that it can be more inclusive of the stepping stones. So it's a less constrained criterion than it is increasing similarity. So one way to imagine this is that basically with a fitness function you are increasingly rewarding progress towards this objective, and that as you discover higher and higher values of fitness, you're increasingly pruning away more and more of the search space. Because you're only considering those individuals that are higher than where you currently are. And in contrast, with novelty, you're just saying you have to do something different than what we've seen in the past. And it's that this idea of difference could continue onwards indefinitely, as opposed to fitness, which might march progressively towards some optimal value. So maybe it's interesting to consider searching just for novelty, just looking for things that are different. But an obvious con of this approach is that you have less control in search. It's not directed towards anything in particular. It's directed outwards towards everything. And this seems like it might not be an effective process, that it might be exhaustive or useless in practice. And so before I address those concerns, I want to make the algorithm just a little bit more concrete so that we can actually talk about what this means in reality. So changing an evolutionary algorithm to search for novelty is pretty simple. You simply replace a fitness function that rewards progress to your goal with a novelty metric that measures distance from things you discovered in the past. And to do this, you have to actually quantify behavior. And so this requires some domain expertise in order to define a space of behaviors for robots in a certain domain. But once you have this quantification, you can use it to measure distances. And then what you can do is measure the novelty of a new individual against both the current population, where search is, and an archive of individuals that were highly novel when they were first discovered. And so that's where search has been in the past. So by directing search away from both of those things, it's into new frontiers of some space of behaviors. And one thing to notice about the diagram that I have is that an interesting thing about novelty is that there are multiple gradients of novelty that diverge. So you're not driving just towards one singular direction, but outwards towards just finding everything you can. And you can see this is a key difference, that if you're guiding search by optimizing fitness with a static fitness function, then you're going to kind of always be directing search in one particular direction. Whereas with search for novelty, you may be diverging throughout the space. And perhaps this speaks a little bit more about our intuitions of how natural evolution works, and that it's naturally a divergent type of search as opposed to a convergent one. So one concern that people often have about novelty search is that maybe it works in some domains, but that it only works because it's effectively an exhaustive search. That you're just enumerating everything and finding every single point in the search space. If this were true, this would be a terrible search method and no one should use it. But it turns out this is not necessarily true, because many points in the search space will map to the same behavior. And so if we're talking about neural networks controlling a robot, you can imagine that if you randomly wired up a robot brain and you put it into a robot and set it loose in the world, your expectations would not be great. This is not going to be an Einstein. It's probably going to turn around in circles and crash through a wall. And in this way, many such randomly wired brains will result in the same degenerate behavior. And what's interesting about this is that you're seeing that domain restrictions limit behavior. So no matter how hard Dumbo tries to fly, gripping onto two balloons, it's going to remain earthbound, which is a sad reality for him. But basically, sometimes doing anything new requires learning about the domain. And so an interesting way to think about this is if you were a skateboarder, for example, and you wanted to invent a new skateboarding trick, you would be better aided by knowing all sorts of different kinds of ways to manipulate the skateboard by learning other tricks than you would by just trying without any knowledge of the past. And so you probably have more confidence that somebody who knows a lot about the domain of skateboarding will be able to do something novel than just a raw beginner. And so there might be some informative gradients to discovering novelty that are not true of just kind of the exhaustive random search process. So to aid our intuitions in why novelty might sometimes be informative, imagine we have a robot in this hallway, and we'd like to evolve a brain for this robot that travels through the hallway and escapes out the doorway over there, the far side. And we want to do this through searching for novel behaviors. So the first thing we do is we wire up a random brain, and he crashes into a wall. And we're actually pleased with this, because we've never seen anything like this before. This is great. So we reward this guy and give him lots of offspring. And as we go through the search space, we find something else. Some of his offspring crash into a different wall. And so we prefer this, the thing we saw before, because this is new. And this is different. It's not necessarily better. It's actually further from achieving our goal. But you can imagine that after all the trivial ways to crash into walls are exhausted, the only way to be novel would be to actually incorporate information from the domain into the robot's brain. And so you might learn how to avoid walls and travel to this point in the maze, which is a novel point. And so we might reward this. And more information might be accumulated into this individual such that he actually travels to the door although it never was an objective of the algorithm. It was just that through filling the space of behaviors, incorporating domain information into the genome, we were able to evolve a solution. So that's kind of an intuitive explanation for why novelty search might be useful, but maybe you actually want some empirical evidence. I think I would probably want that. So I just want to describe some of the initial experiments that we did with novelty search, which were to evolve maze navigators. So I've kind of talked a lot about mazes here. So what we'd like to do is evolve a brain this robot to navigate through this maze. And we'll consider that the lifetime of one particular navigator is just one evaluation in a particular maze. So it's a very short brutish life for these guys, but that's all they get. And they try to reach this kind of objective, this goal within the maze. And so why mazes? Why should we care about mazes? And one reason is that mazes are intended to be tricky or deceptive. We as humans can understand why there's deception in these mazes, and it makes for a nice model. Dead ends in the maze that lead close to the goal are local optima in a search space. And the idea, though, is that maybe mazes they reflect the structure of many problems, that we can kind of take them as a model for problem solving in general, that we can see the navigator as trying to solve a particular problem, and the walls complicate the form of that solution. So maybe, and we have some intuition about this, that maybe, if you're searching from a candle to a light bulb, that there's some local optima there that if you just try to increase the output of a candle, you're not going to get to the light bulb. And that might be deceptive local optima in that sense. In this experiment, we'll compare using fitness function, using novelty search, and also random search to see if there's any useful distinction we can make between these methods. And we'll use the same neuroevolution algorithm with the same settings for all of these. All we'll change is just the reward for a controlled experiment. And so for the fitness-based search, you need a fitness function. And an intuitive fitness function is just distance to the goal. This kind of abstracts the idea of what a fitness function is in general, just searching for something that reaches close to the goal. And for novelty search, we'll also base its characterization of behavior just on one point, which will be the final coordinate that it visits within the maze. So fitness-based search is searching for navigators that get close to the goal, and novelty search is searching for navigators that just end in a different part of the maze than anyone has before in search. So the results are really interesting. So in a medium maze, where there's some sense of deception, so the objective in the medium maze, which is the upper maze here, is to get from the upper left-hand corner to the lower right. So novelty search solves this problem 3 times faster. And random search performs worse. It's an interesting result because this maze in itself doesn't look that difficult. And the Neuroevolution algorithm we use has diversity maintenance in it already. So there is some sense that novelty search is, well suited for mazes, perhaps, or it's just a very interesting result. But 3 times faster is a very significant quantity in terms of usual results of experiments. And the bottom maze is this hard maze, which is more perversely designed to have a kind of a much worse local optimum, because there's a cul-de-sac that leads right up to the goal, and as you might expect, fitness almost never solves it, whereas novelty almost always solves it. And fitness search is as bad as random search. So if you crank up the deception enough, then fitness-based search becomes almost as bad as random search. And perhaps this isn't that surprising, but it's kind of interesting that a search process that's not looking for anything in particular can solve this almost always when fitness is almost never solving it. So I'll just show a animation of what a solution to this problem looks like. Just to give you an intuition for what a maze navigator is. The dotted lines are its rangefinder sensors, and the green pie slice is directs its orientation towards the goal. So it kind of directly traverses the maze. So this is not super impressive, but it's still it's interesting. You can evolve brand to do this, and something that fitness failed to do. But maybe more informative is looking at how these algorithms perform in practice, just kind of seeing how they run. So this movie that I'll show next is comparing a typical run of fitness-based search and novelty search, and plotting each evaluation in the maze. So it plots where each maze navigator ends. And what you'll notice is that the fitness-based search is spending most of its time in the local optima, just bashing its head against the wall. What novelty search is doing, on the other hand, is just spreading through the space of behaviors. And although it's not directly trying to solve the problem, it solves it much sooner than fitness-based search does. So after presenting results in the maze domain, a lot of feedback we got from people was that maybe it's just well fit to mazes. Maybe there's nothing really interesting going on here. And it's certainly true that novelty search is very well fit to mazes. It's kind of an ideal domain. But we also looked into other domains. So one being biped locomotion, which is known to be a difficult domain. You try to evolve a brain for this biped robot so that it can walk for a good distance. And it's unforgiving because if you lose your balance, it's hard to recover, requires coordination, and it's known to be deceptive. So it's deceptive because a really good strategy in initial populations is just to kind of violently throw yourself forward as hard as you can. And you'll travel farther than everybody else, and you'll look kind of good, but as a result, this is not really a stepping stone to anything except for the quick injury, and something you wouldn't want to put into hardware. So there's some motivation for why we think novelty search might do well in this domain, because it is deceptive, and that's kind of what novelty search is well suited for, if you want to practically apply it. And it turns out that if you reward biped locomotors who walk in different ways as opposed to those that walk farther, which is the typical approach, you can actually get better results. So in 20 runs, the novelty best is shown on the right, and on the left is the best fittest walker. So the novelty best is kind of symmetric, and the fittest best here looks like he's got a little bit too much. Yeah. I can fall there. And since we published the biped and the maze experiments, there have been a series of other results that establish that novelty search is maybe a viable tool in the toolkit for solving deceptive problems. It's been tested in genetic programming as well as in artificial neural networks. It's helped to train plastic ANNs that learn from experience, to work with virtual creatures, and it can actually encourage more evolvable representations over time. So the argument isn't that knowledge search is better than fitness-based search, but that it's different and it might have some benefits for certain problems. But in general, maybe we also are just interested in knowledge search in its own right for what it looks like to have a different kind of search that's driven just by creativity. And I think that's what more interests me personally. So the last thing I want to talk about here is maybe an idea that is pretty intuitive, that clearly evolution is not just a search for novelty. There's more to it than that. Evolution is richer than optimization. Evolution is richer than just a raw search for novelty. And maybe getting closer to what a more realistic abstraction of evolution is, maybe merging some pressure for novelty with some pressure to achieve. So there really is some kind of optimization going on in evolution, that individuals are selected based on how well they can outcompete other organisms. But can we merge these two ideas in a way that prioritizes diversity, that we can still have an explosion of really interesting, diverse things coming out of the search process? And an instructive thing to consider before trying to attempt this project is exploring how competition is usually treated in evolutionary computation. And usually this is with a global competition fitness function. And what I mean by that is that basically everybody is competing with everybody. And that fitness is this absolute quantity, and that no matter if you're a blade of grass or an eagle, you're going to be compared on the same kind of scale. Even with diversity maintenance techniques that speciate individuals and allow for reduced competition, the comparisons operate generally on the same scale. And the implicit assumption here is that every niche has the same capacity for fitness. And the question you're asking basically is, how does an individual rank compared to the rest of the population as a whole? But then if we look at competition in nature, it's a little bit different. It's clearly not global in that bacteria are not directly competing with grass. There's no drive towards a singularity, as there often is with a global competition fitness function. And it's true that the capacity for niches is often very different. So I would not want to get into competition with a bacteria and who can reduce faster, because it's been about 30 years, and so far I'm coming up short. So some bacteria can reproduce in minutes, and we take decades. And it's not that bacteria are better than humans in any real sense. It's just that we live in different niches, and the niche that I live in is very luxurious, and it allows me plenty of time and trillions of cells before I have to reproduce. So maybe we can look at competition in nature a different way. We can abstract it as a local competition fitness function, one that actually does respect some things about what we expect from nature. So maybe this conception, fitness is relative. So instead of asking, how do you rank compared to everybody in the entire population, you might ask, how many similar organisms do you outperform? And so this might respect that solutions in some niches might be interesting, but not optimal. So, for example, me, I'm not optimal. This kind of motivates the novelty search with local competition algorithm. And the idea is that instead of just having a raw reward for novelty, there's two rewards, and we accomplish this through a multi-objective evolutionary algorithm. You have one objective that is driving towards novelty, and another towards local competition. And so the interrogation process for a new individual is kind of two steps. You might ask at first, do you represent a novel type of solution? And if you do, that's fine, you get lots of offspring. But if not, are you competitive? Are you at least competitive within your niche, or whatever the task is? And if you are, then that's good too. So it's a way to merge pressure to diverge through novelty with limited pressure to achieve this limited competition fitness idea. And you can also see this as maybe being driven by a different abstraction of nature. Seeing evolution as a search for many locally good ways of doing the same thing. So in nature, that same thing is to survive and reproduce. But in an algorithm, we can make it whatever we want it to be. And so I want to talk about some experiments where we tried this in a virtual creatures domain. So if you're familiar with virtual creatures, it's basically evolving the morphology and the control structure for some kind of organism in some simulated world. And the most famous result is probably from Carl Sims' leaflets full screen. So I think probably many of you have seen this video before. I'll show a couple of snips of it to give you an idea of what it's like. So you have these creatures in some environments. Here they're swimming. You can also have them evolved on land environments, and they'll usually evolve to do something particular. And many experiments, it will involve locomotion. So one thing I want to note is that when you see kind of results like this, these kind of videos, typically what happens is that each one of these creatures is from a separate run of evolution. That you'll try to run evolution to get a really good locomotor, and then you'll showcase it, and then you'll do another run to get another individual. And somehow this kind of disagrees with our intuitions about nature, and that nature is just one big run. So it'd be kind of cooler if we could get lots of locomotors, different strategies out of one run of evolution. And that's kind of what motivates this experiment. So what we want to see in this experiment is a diversity of interesting locomotors. And this might not be the most practical thing to want, but it would be kind of fun, kind of cool, and maybe in the spirit of artificial life. That this might remind us more of nature than just seeing one locomotor that travels okay. And what's interesting is that novelty search with local competition gives us a vocabulary to kind of implement such a search. We can search for novelty in the creature's morphology and reward them for locomoting competitively with creatures that live in their niche. So we measure novelty by morphology and fitness by their ability to locomote. And the results are pretty nice in that we can discover lots of different morphologies, effective strategies for locomotion for these morphologies in one run. And so this is kind of maybe more in line with what evolution does than just one creature per run. Now I can show a couple of videos here. They're kind of fun to see. So here's this little horse guy who kind of gallops off into the distance, wagging his tail. And this is kind of, he goes at a good clip. This is kind of characteristic of something you might see in a lot of systems. But we actually get a couple of more solutions. So another kind of quadruped, some morphology. He looks at a different area of the morphology space. He's a little shorter. And what's interesting is that you also get results out of this system that you wouldn't get out of a typical fitness-driven system, something driven solely by fitness, in that some niches have very low capacity for fitness, yet they might be interesting to see. So, here's this guy. He lives in a very, very difficult part of the niche space. He needs to be very skinny, very light, but very tall. And so this is about the best you can do. But I'm happy to see this. It's kind of a surprising, interesting solution. He's not very fast, but he can balance, particularly as he kind of hops along, I think is interesting. You also get let's see what's that one. Well, this is a kind of like scorpion-like guy you also get. It was not who I was looking for, though. Okay, here's a guy. So this is also not a very fast locomotor, but very short and trying to be spread out and as heavy as possible. You know, he's kind of struggling here, but once again, I think it's kind of interesting to see this diversity of different solutions. It's just kind of fun and surprising to look through the results. All right. So I hope I've convinced you that there's some interesting properties of different abstractions of evolution that are more focused on pure creativity, or creativity with a slight drive towards achievement. So you can abstract evolution as a pure search for novelty, or as a search for many locally proficient ways to do the same thing, and get some interesting results. And maybe more interestingly is just that search need not be guided by objectives. We can guide search by alternative information and still get interesting results. So guiding a search by novelty can lead to some kinds of fun things. And maybe we need to be aware of some of the limits of the objective-based paradigm. That it's true that we can't just set an arbitrary target and hope to evolve towards it. And there's different ways to get around this. We might have to inject more human knowledge. There's a particular objective that we want to reach. And more knowledge into the fitness function. But in general, if possible, we like to avoid that. And I'd like to reiterate that the message here is not that novelty search is better, or will more often be better than not, but just that it's a different way to look at search, a different way to look at evolution. It's a different kind of creative search. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that I think we all believe that evolution is richer than just pure optimization. And I think an interesting challenge moving forward is how can we create more profoundly creative evolutionary algorithms. Thank you. I'll take questions now.
Go for it, Gerald.
Okay. I have a question here, Evolution.
Okay.
Is this okay, I have a question from Evolution. So I'm a little perturbed by the nomenclature about fitness search and novelty search. And my question is whether that's actually established in the literature that you call the fitness search. In the novelty search, you also assign fitness. You assign fitness to novelty. And in what you call here the fitness search, you assign high fitness to a distance measure. And I'm just a little annoyed.
So that's a comment that comes up often, right? Can we just view knowledge search as considering novelty as a fitness function? And so I think it's important to make distinctions in our language that reflect different kinds of things. So, for example, I think that a search for novelty is not like a traditional fitness-based search. If you have a static fitness function, then basically you can rank all individuals in a search space before you even encounter them. And you have some kind of ranking of them. And you're searching for the best one in that space. So one way that a search for novelty is different than that is that there's no way to assign novelty beforehand. It doesn't make any sense outside the context of the search. It depends on what you find first. And so I think that there's different kinds of search processes, and that we should use different terminology for them. Certainly, you can fold lots of things into one kind of concept and say this is just a different kind of fitness function. But I choose not to, and you might choose a different thing. But I think that making distinctions is helpful, at least in discussion.
I just think that you're actually assigning fitness somehow in the novelty search as well. I mean, you're saying there's no fitness. Just because you don't have a function beforehand where you can map all of gene type space as a fitness landscape, doesn't mean that there isn't fitness there, just because it's changing all the time.
Right, so I mean, the two things that I'm contrasting are maybe a static fitness landscape and the landscape that knowledge search induces. So I do think that there's a fundamental difference between having a search space where fitness can be assigned a priori to everything in the search space, whereas a knowledge search is just...
No, I totally agree with that. I'm just miffed about the nomenclature.
Okay. I see. Yeah. I mean, maybe there's a better terminology that could be used. I prefer not to, but yeah, maybe there's something else out there.
I mean, it kind of seems like even the way you're using the terminology explaining it, that the difference, the really essential difference, is whether it's static or not.
Yeah, right.
And in the end, there's fitness on both sides, right? Like in the novelty ones, the more novel ones do better. And for evolutionary biologists, we would probably call that fitness, that more novel ones are more fit. And it's just that it's not a static criterion.
There's some truth to that. Maybe the terminology doesn't help things so much, in that I guess it's nice to have this kind of really strict dichotomy, so you can kind of consider these things differently. And so maybe just between a static fitness function and knowledge search, I think there's a fundamental difference. Maybe there's some better terminology. I mean, the idea of a fitness function and biological fitness, there already is some confusion and differences between those things. So I think we're kind of stuck with some language that is inherently conflicted in itself.
Maybe instead of fitness space, this search you could say object.
Right, yeah, so that's something that we have done in the past, is focus more on objective-based search versus non-objective-based search, and that maybe is a more useful dichotomy.
Probably especially around biologists.
Yeah. Well, it's helpful for me to
Hi.
talk about it. Especially okay. Hi.
Question from Idaho. Hello?
Hello.
Hi. Question
Hi.
from Idaho from a logical perspective.
Okay.
You talk about natural evolution, and I am wondering if you really mean natural selection or evolution, with evolution being change over time and natural selection being one's fitness optimization.
Right, yeah.
I think this is another semantic, maybe related.
Right, yeah, exactly. I think it is a semantic thing, but I guess it's true that this research mostly focuses on selection pressure. So there is kind of a comparison between, fitness in evolutionary algorithms and natural selection. But I guess I'm inspired by the process of evolution and what it creates. So there's some of both.
Okay. And also you compare fitness with novelty. And
right.
I think I understand your computational perspective, but fitness in biology relies on novelty. The two are not independent.
Right, yeah, I agree. And so, yeah, maybe again, once again, what we're coming back to is the idea of kind of objective-based search in computer science versus search processes not driven by, optimization alone. And so you're right that in biological systems, of course, fitness and confidence is a lot more than just pressure to optimize for something specific.
So I'm not sure I understood the difference you're getting at here. So you said fitness in biology sort of depends on novelty. So did the coelacanth's fitness slowly decrease over time even though the thing stayed the same?
What I mean is that you can't. I see novelty as mutation.
Okay. I see.
Can we, MSU, I'm just wondering what you mentioned about incorporating a second objective and using your novelty as a second objective in a multi-objective sort of fitness evaluation seems very valuable, and it echoes what we've seen in so many domains where introduction of a second objective helps to maintain the diversity of search so that you can do a more effective search with regard to the first objective, even if you're not interested in the second objective. And in this case, having this kind of novelty as the second objective appears to offer something very attractive in terms of searching the search space. So that seems like a particularly nice idea to me.
Yeah. It turns out that diversity in a behavioral space is sometimes more useful than just diversity, just a strictly genotypic space. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting results in what they call multi-objectivization, where you just add other objectives just for this purpose of adding them, and that they might actually aid search for the first thing, although you're not interested in it at all.
Yes.
Yeah. There's another comment from MSU. There is this concept in optimization called dynamic optimization. You mentioned static objective functions. But in dynamic optimization, your objective function is changing with time. As you are optimizing, your objective function changes.
Like co-evolution.
It's not entirely co-evolution. I mean, it's as you're trying, so you're always tracking the
That's
optima.
a subset. Yeah.
It's, so as you're optimizing for a particular function, you've gone close to the optima, but the optima has changed. Because either the environment has changed or some other situation. I mean, co-evolution is a particular example of dynamic optimization.
Gotcha.
So I always thought that evolution is not a static optimization. If you correlate evolution with optimization, it comes closely with dynamic optimization. So some of the examples you showed before, where things have changed, their functionality have changed over time,
Yes.
could be that at that point there was another objective that needed to be optimized, and then with time that objective has changed. So those functionalities that were present before has to change to something else. So if you see it, all these things in the light of dynamic optimization, all this evolution makes sense. So I wouldn't really dismiss saying that evolution is not an optimization, but definitely it's not a static. Optimization is trying to maximize or minimize one objective function, but something that is, it's trying to optimize something that is changing with time constantly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that we can view evolution, these added dynamics, and that helps explain some parts of it. So, I mean, if you take coevolution in particular, like coevolution results in artificial evolution, there are still things like local optima there. Degenerate states where like the arms race dynamic starts to peter out or you go in circles. So that even in coevolution, there are some examples where you can still be deceived in some sense. So I don't know if we can fully understand exactly how to create a system where you just get around those problems. At least in a computer, usually we can control the problems. But if we're trying to abstract from nature and try to create something that process, I don't know if we've accomplished that yet.
From you to kind of continuing in that theme, I'm unfamiliar with the idea of having like an archive that you compare for novelty against. I work with a lot of stuff where you try to maintain diversity in a population, and then you kind of explore the space by keeping a kind of continuous diversity present. Have you experimented with times when having an archive is more beneficial or is detrimental to different types of search?
So yeah, the idea of archive, that in particular is not new. It's a common kind of use in coevolution to try to encourage progress. So other coevolutionary algorithms also have something similar to that. But it is useful. We've done ablation experiments in lots of domains, and it does tend to increase performance. It induces more pressure to not backtrack to where you've been in the past. As to an example of a domain where it wouldn't be as helpful, I can't think of one offhand, but there probably are those such things.
Another question from UW, actually, and it plays off of the coevolutionary thing that you just brought up. It seems like in all these cases, how you define novelty should influence the way that these runs proceed. So one critical question is how one defines novelty, and I'm just curious whether you've played around with not sort of objectively defining novelty, but rather allowing evolution itself to define novelty within the system. So imagine your maze-solving organism is being chased by a predator, which is also evolving, and that has its own, maybe it has some reward for novelty as well, but you could also imagine just a straight sort of nearness to the prey being a reward. I'm just curious about how systems with, you mentioned that you brought competition into this, which is a negative ecological interaction, but you could also look at victim-exploiter interactions with a positive-negative interaction, and that antagonistic interaction might be a driver toward diversity and novelty as well. So one question is what the form of the novelty is, how do you define novelty? I'm curious how many sort of different ways of defining novelty you play.
I see. Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and that is a key factor in deciding how an experiment will evolve is that the experimenter will put some knowledge of what novelty means to them in a domain into the experiment. So the algorithm's conception of novelty as it is right now is fairly simplistic. It maps behaviors to some kind of Euclidean space, and it's not nearly as rich as our own intuitions about novelty, for sure. So that there's some, I think it'd be really interesting if there was a way to automatically characterize novelty in some kind of recognition system that was more nuanced than what currently we do. As for the other ideas of expanding not just competition, but including other kind of ecological forces that might be encouraging novelty or interesting to see, I haven't really thought much about that in particular, but that is an interesting idea of expanding that out. Like competition is just one aspect, as you said, of these different kinds of interactions.
Question from MSU. I was wondering, it seems like the use of novelty here is kind of to look at phenotypic diversity as opposed to genotypic diversity. And I was wondering, do you think that any of these features will translate in places where genotypes are more directly mapped to phenotype, I guess? Or is this just an artifact, or maybe a useful artifact, of the complex decoding of a genotype to a phenotype?
Right, yeah, so this idea of searching for novelty is definitely going to be more effective the greater kind of the complexity of the mapping between behavior and genotype. And if you just did a novelty search on a genotype space, it would just be equivalent to kind of raw enumeration or just kind of a driven search throughout the genotype space, which probably wouldn't, result in anything interesting or useful. So yeah, I think that the kinds of things that novelty search is applicable to are mainly going to be those where you have some genotype-phenotype mapping that is pretty unpredictable.
Because it felt like to me, especially on the maze example, if you did a random search of the phenotype space instead of a random search of the genotype space, you would probably lose very quickly. Just because, well, random search of this phenotype space is much smaller than the brains or the neural networks.
Yeah, I guess the challenge though is that of course we can't just randomly sample the phenotype space because we don't know how to get to place. But yeah, if we could do that, then you're right, and that would be a better solution. I wish we could.
Yeah, I would say novelty search best benefits from situations, especially where a genotype maps to some sort of behavior, because there's usually many more genotypes than there are phenotypes.
And so. I think that's the key to it, though, is that the phenotype space has to be much smaller than the genotype space. Otherwise, I'm not sure.
I don't know if that's been empirically shown, but
it might be something interesting to look at.
Cough, research paper. So another comment from MSU. So I wanted to ask about your novelty search with local competition. So you, if I understood right, you use novelty search on the morphology, and then fitness on how far it walked, I believe. And so what prevents the population from just evolving completely different morphologies? Was there some kind of constraint on the morphologies to where every single I guess creature in the population couldn't just have a different morphology and be in its own niche?
Right. So what happens in practice is that there's a balance between the novelty objective and the fitness objective. That the Pareto front will be such that you'll kind of balance those ideas in the middle of that Pareto front. So the individuals will spread throughout the population, but there will also be some. The individuals spread across morphology space, but they'll make little clusters basically in the morphology space. And the local competition objective will optimize the individuals within those little clusters. So that makes some sense.
So then the local or I guess the fitness does play an important factor in there. It must play a critical factor. My understanding was that it was just it only mattered within its niche, but it seems
right. Yeah. Right. So I mean, yeah, there's two opposing forces. The force to spread across morphology and have a unique morphology that is balanced against just this pressure to do well. I mean, to basically, let me think. It's been a while.
Can I ask maybe a clarifying question? What did there are lots of ways to do multi-objective optimization or bi-objective optimization. You have to somehow balance or control the diversity of the spread, or how fast you're driving toward the ideal point versus how diverse your solutions are. Is there a particular method that you used for the multi-objective search?
Yeah, we use NSGA too.
Okay.
Okay. So,
this is Professor Deb here who wrote it.
It's a very good search out. Very good. I like it.
I thought so when I saw those results. I thought so.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, that implicitly addresses the question that you're asking. Is it's doing crowding to spread the solutions along that front, as well as not just favoring one or the other.
If I've understood it right, so if you have two solutions, let's say both of them have very similar morphology, but one goes a large distance than the other, then you will prefer the one that goes to large distance. But
exactly, yeah.
But if you have two solutions that it's very good, one is very good in morphology, but not so good in the distance, the other is very good in going distances, but not so in morphology, you will have both. That's how we get the diversity.
And so NSGA2 actually introduces a third, or a second form of diversity in terms of spreading the solutions out on that Pareto curve. And that is, difference in both objectives in some sense. That it's trying to create individuals that are uniformly distributed in balance between the two objectives. So that's yet another form of diversity.
Not how far blocked, but the rank that was blocking the goal relative to the niche.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very nuanced.
Okay, so one more comment from OSU. I'm a fan of novelty search, sorry. I don't remember if you mentioned this in your papers or not, but the biological equivalent of novelty search that I've always seen is density-dependent selection. Would you agree to that?
Right.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly. That's the exact biological equivalent, right?
Okay. Cool.
Any other questions? Well, if not, let's thank Joel very much. Very interesting.